Hi everyone, it's your boy Fresh, and I'm here to tell you why the primary arms 3X SLx Microprism is, depending on your mission criteria, one of the best single-point multi-purpose sights on the market today. In order to properly describe the features of this particular prism, we have to take a look at the 3X market segment. 3X magnification encompasses a very large product category for very good reason. If we use the half X per 100 yard magnification rule, 3X fits in a very nice spot for various carbines. The magnification is shallow enough to allow for 25 or 50 yard shooting with ease, and can still reach out to 600 yards with a very stable and supported position. With some of these distances kept in mind, it does allow for a fairly visible BDC for 5.56 out to or past 600 yards, as mentioned before. I can split this product segment into roughly three categories. One would be what I call your Generation 1 battle prisms, the second being your red dot magnifiers, and the third being your Gen 2 small footprint prisms. We'll first start with what I call the Gen 1 battle prisms. To an extent these are listed chronologically, but some are a little bit newer than others further up the list. Let's start with our weight. The original primary arms 3X Gen 1 prism weighs in at 18.4 ounces. The Vortex 3X Gen 1 Spitfire weighs in at 15.4 ounces. The still currently sold Burris AR332 weighs in a little bit lighter at 14.2 ounces. When we look at some of the slightly newer optics on this Gen 1 list, we also have the Sig Bravo 3. It weighs in at a hefty 22 ounces dry. Steiner jumped in the game not too long ago with their T332, which weighs in at 16 ounces flat. Out of this list of Gen 1 prisms, the Trijicon TA33 is the lightest out of all of them at 9.8 ounces. One wild card that I will put in this particular category is also the Monstrum 330p, a Amazon special if you will, at 17 ounces. You can almost think of this situation as a little story. The Gen 1 battle prisms came out and had certain size and weight constraints. When red dots were very popular and users wanted a bit of magnification, the solution to the conundrum between red dots and magnified prisms was a red dot magnifier. The Sig Juliet 3 weighs in at 12.5 ounces, already lighter than quite a bit of these battle prisms from above. EOTech also came out with their G33 model, which weighs in at 10.6 ounces. Its cousin, the G43, weighs in at 11.3 ounces with a slightly larger body. A very popular choice here is the Vortex Micro 3X, which weighs in at 9.5 ounces. Holosun's entry here with the HM3X weighs in about 9.8 ounces. Up till about 2018-2019, Prism Gang was getting a run for its money. The Gen 1 battle prisms somewhat look a little long in the tooth, they were a bit too heavy, too bulky, had a lot of rails sticking out of them, and not many mounting options. The red dot and magnifier combo became a very popular choice for competition and even tactical shooters. Therefore, a lot of companies decide to refresh their prism lines to try to compete with the size and weight constraints that those looking for red dots and magnifiers may look for. Vortex decided to make an update to their Gen 1 prism by coming out with the Gen 2 Spitfire, which weighs in at 9 ounces. A significant decrease in weight for a somewhat similar footprint. The second wildcard on our list here is our Swamp Fox 3X prism, which weighs in at 15.4 ounces, which doesn't seem to look like an improvement, but we'll take a look at some of this stuff a little bit later. Burris decided to make an update to their prism line with their very small and very lightweight Burris RT3, which weighs in at 8.8 ounces, an astounding reduction versus their AR332. Not to be outdone, however, Primary Arms, with their Microprism, weighs in at less than 8 ounces. Okay, so our 3X Microprism is the lightest of the bunch by a significant margin. Where else does it shine? Looking at the Gen 1 battle prisms again, our PA 3X Gen 1 has a field of view about 31.5 feet at 100 yards. Vortex's Gen 1 3X is about similar. It's very possible they ended up using the same glass or a similar manufacturer at the time, but I need to do a little bit more digging to confirm this. Burris improves on this a little bit by about 6 inches to a total of 32 feet at 100 yards. SIG, while thickening their glass a little bit and potentially adding a little weight, does end up with a very large field of view of 52.4 feet at 100 yards, which is incredible for a 3X. Steiner's T332 has about a field of view of 33.79 feet at 100 yards, which for a prism at about the 6th generation is not so great. Even more disappointingly so, the Trijicon TA33 ACOG has a field of view of only 19.3 feet at 100 yards, something that was mentioned in another video before. If we look at our wildcard again, the 330p from Monstrum, the Amazon special, it has a surprisingly large field of view of 39.3 feet at 100 yards. In order for the 3X magnifiers to maintain some relevance over the prisms, optical quality had to change as well. We have a fairly even distribution of field of view across these magnifiers. The SIG Juliet 3 is at about 41.9 feet at 100 yards, an excellent number. The Otec G33 is about 38.2 feet at 100 yards. Its cousin, the G43, a little bit better at about 39.3 feet. A popular micro footprint magnifier here, the Micro 3X from Vortex, is at about 38.2 feet. Very respectable. Holosun's HM3X is no slouch either, at about 36.1 feet at 100 yards. It would seem that the smaller prisms have a tough act to follow with the magnifiers that they are hoping to compete against, right? Well, Vortex manages a respectable 37.9, or might as well be 38 feet at 100 yards for their field of view. Our second wild card, the Swamp Fox 3X, manages a massive 52 feet at 100 yards, very similar to the SIG Bravo 3. Burst's RT3 is at about 38.2 feet, and Primary Arms is not very far behind at about 38 feet exactly. We look at normalized field of view, which is the magnification times the field of view at 100 yards, we end up with these numbers. These various prisms relative to each other don't compare very much differently since they're all the same magnification, but you can get an idea of the absolute numbers compared to LPVOs. The Gen 1 battle prisms are around 95 to 96 feet, with the Steiner 332 being on the high end of that scale at about 101.37 feet at 100 yards. Given the Monstrum 330p's 117 to 118 score, it should fare very well or feel very big compared to some 3Xs on some LPVOs. The SIG Bravo 3 at a score of 157 should feel absolutely massive to the user's eye, almost like an ACOG. How about our magnifiers? Most of them hover at around 110 to 117 as their scores. Most of these should be in line actually with the 1Xs on most LPVOs, so the field of view should feel quite ample. How do our small footprint prisms fare in this case? Our 3X magnifiers here look like a significant improvement. Despite some of the higher numbers we're seeing in some of these Gen 1 battle prisms, the magnifiers are a bit more consistent in terms of their field of view score. We have a low of 108 and a high of about 125 to 126. Both numbers either equivalent or better than the 1X of some LPVOs. What about our small footprint prisms? These are not terribly far behind, with our 3X Microprism ending up at around 114 as a score, and our unusual Swamp Fox 3X at about 156, similar to the SIG Bravo 3. When it comes to eye relief, we start to see some interesting trends. Some consistently better results in eye relief can actually be seen from the Gen 1 battle prisms. PA's 3X Gen 1 is almost 3 inches. Vortex, not following very far behind, is about 2.8. Burst's AR332, though not the best in this segment, is still quite respectable at 2.5. SIG's Bravo 3 manages about 3 inches. Steiner's T332 manages 2.75. Trigicon's ACOG TA33 manages a dismal 1.9 inches. Monstrum's 330p is best in class in this case at about 3.5 inches. In terms of our magnifiers, the eye relief numbers start to get a little bit worse. SIG's Juliet 3 is at a flat 2 inches of eye relief. EOTech's G33 is not much better at 2.2. The G43 manages about 2.5 inches. Vortex with their Micro 3X manages about 2.6. And Holosun bests this with their HM3X a little bit at about 2.7. With the newer, smaller prisms coming out, will this trend get any worse? Well, not exactly. Vortex's 3X Spitfire Gen 2 still manages about 2.6 inches. Swamp Fox, the wild card, with a couple of unusual features, probably had to make some sacrifices and got to about 2.36. Slightly lower, but still respectable. Versus RT3 is about 2.6, and Primary Arms Microprism ends up at about 2.7. Alright, so with all these numbers, how does our 3X Microprism stack up against this competition? When we try our previous scoring system again from our prism magnification selection video, our 3X Microprism ends up getting our top score, and by a significant margin. So what does this mean quantitatively? In a practical sense, the 3X Microprism has a great balance of low weight, very large field of view, a good normalized field of view number compared to some LPVOs, and a generous amount of eye relief. Okay, we can look at spreadsheets all day, but what's the big deal when we look through this thing? Well, first of all, we see a fairly decent image. Looks pretty big for such a small optic body. We have a little bit of discoloration on the edges. They look prismatic. We see a significant portion of the color spectrum on the edges. You can look at the illumination here. And the dot seems very light bright. And this image seems increasingly red depending on the daylight conditions. The reticle is the typical ACSS Raptor that we described in an earlier video. You can look at the eye relief here. Compared to the 1X Microprism, this eye relief is a little bit closer, and I think the eye box is a little bit tighter, to be honest. But not absolutely unforgiving, to be honest. Even if you're outside of the eye relief range, the artifact that you get on the left-hand side really isn't terribly obtrusive. If we do a little bit of walking or dynamic pointing, the 3X is fairly easy to use. Without any illumination on, I think this is a fairly quick optic to acquire targets with. Now, the problem with the chevron is, despite the infinite aiming point that's implied by the chevron, it would still be very difficult, I think, to make shots at longer distances because the chevron will sometimes block the image, depending on the color and size of the target. Looking a little bit up at the sky, we get a little bit more of that discoloration here. Now let's walk around a little bit with our illumination on the highest setting. Still feels daylight bright on this somewhat overcast day, and I think you could do some decent back shooting with this one. I tried it a couple of times, and at 3X still doesn't seem quite as... 3X doesn't seem to be quite enough magnification to prevent you from being disoriented when trying back. But in this particular optic, I think the image blurs enough where you can use this somewhat as a red dot in occluded shooting. I talked with Brock a couple of months ago about this, and he kind of confirmed the same thing. This thing actually works fairly decently for back shooting. Overall, despite some discoloration at the edges, some obstruction from the ACSS Raptor reticle, this prism is very pleasant to look through, extremely surprising, especially when you consider its size. And just a quick note on the size itself, it is very similar in footprint, especially with mounting options, to the 1X Microprism with the ACSS Cyclops. In terms of construction, there's some similarities. In fact, I dare say that the 3X Microprism probably shares a forging die of some sort with the 1X in certain ways, depending on if forging is actually involved in this process. But it looks like a 1X Microprism turned backwards with threading put in a different direction, the controls being reversed, and then the prism assembly being inserted in at the other side. That's just an observation. The only way you can tell is where the location of the PA logo is on both, but I'll let you be the judge of that. I think the implication of this move really was that Primary Arms was looking to save cost a little bit by sharing some common tooling and machining tools, which I think was a very good economic move on their part. On a quick note, I'll dive into a couple of quick features here. For the 3X, Primary Arms decided to switch to an adjustment gradation of a half MOA per click at 100 yards, which I think is a much welcome improvement over the 1X's 1 MOA click per 100 yards. That little bit of additional precision, I think, will help a lot with shooters when it comes to getting a very precise zero. It's not the end of the world if it is 1 MOA click at 100 yards, but I think that despecking trend is not a good trajectory for civilian shooters, in my opinion. Another welcome improvement, I think, on this 3X, again, it really depends on if there are running changes on this line, is the diopter ring being a little bit easier to turn. I'm also happy to note that Primary Arms also made the illumination dial a little bit easier to turn and added some more positive and tactile clicks to it. It also doesn't feel as loose as the 1X Cyclops Prism that I had before. Sometimes little features like this kind of bolster my impression of the overall build quality of a product. Unfortunately, I haven't given the 3X's ACSS Raptor reticle a fair shake in our comparison tests when I was doing the Vortex 5X video. I basically confined this reticle to M193 out of a 20-inch barrel. I don't think this assessment was accurate, so I'll come up with some criteria for what makes a decent BDC or what makes a appropriate zero for a particular BDC. For me, I first start with a 100-yard zero and below. Truing can be done at a greater distance once this rough zero is achieved. In this zero, 3 of the 4 hash marks in the case of this reticle have to line up within 15 yards of the nearest whole 100-yard increment. Let's try this with a couple of the mounts provided. The cantilever low spacer gives you a height over rail of 1.41. If we assume a nominal height over bore above the rail of 1.25, this gives you a total height of 2.66. At 3,100 feet per second, I got about a 70-yard zero, where the top 3 BDC lines end up working quite well. This became a little bit harder when I went down to 3,000 feet per second, in which I determined about a 56-yard zero in this following BDC. At about 2,900 feet per second for some of these slower barrels, let's just say 12.5 to 11.5 for M193, you end up with a 45-yard zero. The medium cantilever gives you a 1.535 height over rail, and therefore a total of 2.875 height over bore. At 3,100 feet per second, you get a similar rough zero of 70 yards. At 3,000 feet per second, again, not much has changed. We just bumped up about 2 yards to about 58 yards. At 2,900, however, we end up with a 50-yard zero instead. Quite a large difference. Since the straight spacer is exactly the same height, those zeros apply as well. So let's look at the high cantilever here. The high cantilever height over rail is 1.64, giving you a total of 2.89. This yields a 3,100 feet per second zero of 75 yards. At 3,000, you get about 60 yards. At 2,900 feet per second, it only changes slightly to about 52 yards. There's an interesting trend going on here. If you start combining these mounts, let's say the straight and low cant, this becomes a little bit more apparent. Straight and low cant gives about 1.845, therefore yielding a total of 3.095 inches. At 3,100, you have about an 80-yard zero, 3,000, 65, and 2,900, 55 yards. If you combine the straight and median cantilever, you get the 1.97 height over rail, yielding 3.22 total. At 3,100, you get an 88-yard zero, at 3,000, 70 yards, and a 2,900, 60 yards. If you go for the highest mount possible, which ends up being a chin weld for some people, but still quite a comfortable position for a night vision, you get a spacer height of 2.075 and have a total of 3.325. At 3,100 feet per second, you get a 92-yard zero, at 3,000, 73 yards, and at 2,900, 62 yards. So what is this telling us here exactly? Well, the problem with this particular reticle is that it's a bit peaky at lower velocities. By peaky, I mean the usefulness of the reticle starts to diminish very quickly past 500 yards. For 55 grain, the further you deviate from 3,100 feet per second, the more difficult it is to set the proper zero the closer you get to 600 yards. This is an unfortunate reality with this BDC when it comes to 55 grain. And honestly, because the 55 grain projectiles, low BC, this doesn't work all the time. However, I think we could expect better results from M855. Okay, I think I got inside of Dimitri's head here for a second. I think the intended use at sea level for this particular optic was for traditionalists somewhat. Those who want their M16 using original M193 are going to have a reticle that lines up very well with a 20-inch barrel. Those using the 16-inch or 14.5 using the M4 for the period correct M855 ammunition are likely going to find BDCs that work pretty well at various heights here. In fact, I made a quick pattern. For the low mount, I got about 75 yards, medium, 80, high, 85 yards. Straight plus low, 90 yards. Straight plus medium, 95 yards. And straight plus high, 100 yards for the heights, respectively. So this reticle wasn't being strange like I thought before. It's just that it was calibrated for two different weapon systems, usually how they were traditionally used previously. Once you start crisscrossing this barrel and ammunition combination, you should expect that no more than 2 or 3 of the BDC marks should line up very nicely with your hundreds of yards. So in this case, Dimitri wasn't really being silly, he was just being traditional. And that's probably fine by me. However, this BDC won't fare terribly well using something as short as a Mark 18 or something as longer in the short barrel types as a 12.5, unfortunately. It may seem ridiculous to try this on a magnified prism optic, but what is this thing like under night vision? Now if we look through the PES-14 here for a moment, on the first setting of the 3X, with the diopter set more or less correctly, there's a little bit of bloom on the reticle, but nothing serious. It's, I would say, better than an ACOG, about as good as the 1X prism. And there's this interesting shrouding effect, if I could call it that. You'd get into the field of view, and then your image is massive. Your full field of view is in the night vision goggle, and then it goes away. It's sort of superimposed. You know, I'm kind of around the image here, and I think because of the depth of field, boom, look at this. It's just this large image, and I'm going to have to look into why this is the case, but this is kind of the first setting. The other two are a little bright, but is this usable in the dark with a single goggle? Not quite. And this turned off, of course. If we give a bit of a tap, yeah, there we go. It does turn back on. So it's kind of interesting. Now, I could say this is usable with back shooting under a dual goggle, but under a single goggle, this is difficult. There's just not enough light transmission through this 3X. Under very bright conditions, I think it's usable, but again, visible targets only out to 25 to 40 yards, in my opinion. It'd be very difficult to identify without using something with better light transmission like an EOTech or Aimpoint Pro. In closing, I'm absolutely enamored with this thing. It packs a great amount of magnification for its size, possesses very tactile controls in the diopter and illumination settings, has a finer adjustment per click versus the 1X Microprism, possesses flexible but durable mounting solutions, yields a decent image, and one of the best reticles I've seen in terms of wind holds for this size of optic. However, for a few reasons, this won't be my primary. The optic has decent eye relief, but suffers from a fairly tight eye box for a 3X. The image quality towards the edges is also less than optimal due to the red tints and prismatic aberration, and the ACSS Raptor BDC is just not as flexible as that of the Vortex 5X. The optic is decent under night vision, but the entire setup is just not as flexible as a 1X Microprism backed by a 3X magnifier. Also, despite the fact that you can use back shooting with this optic, there's still a distinctive lack of a true 1X. You can choose to pair an offset red dot using, let's say, an Arisaka mount, or using Primary Arms' quite well designed offset mount that's built into the primary mount itself. It sort of detracts from the compact nature of the entire setup. I think a version of this optic using a piggyback mount, especially with the upcoming 5X, would help quite a bit. In fact, this piggyback capability might make this a better contender than the 1x microprism with a magnifier in many cases, still yielding a much lighter setup. If you plan on only doing daytime shooting, use a single rifle, and want the absolute lightest package possible, this might be your prism. However, for the set of criteria that my setup needs to meet, this doesn't quite cut it. However, for the price, I think this is one of the best prism optics you can buy. At a price of about $300 on Amazon, I think this is a great buy for a second or third rifle, or somebody that you would want to teach to learn how to shoot, and do so quite effectively. In fact, I dare say this is the ultimate carbine competition optic in a sense. I know some of these are hot takes, but with some of the time that I've used, I'm going to have to stick to my guns here. I appreciate you guys making it this far in the video and going on this journey with me. I know some of these videos are long and it's hard to maintain such a long attention span, but I would really appreciate if you guys subscribed so I can keep motivated to make this kind of content. If you like what you see or you don't, please leave a comment and some useful feedback, and I'd love to make more of these in-depth types of optic reviews for you. You guys take care, and I will see you on the range.